it was an auto accident, and essentially that because of the auto accident, I needed to then have brain surgery to stop the brain bleed. And there was a few other, I guess, issues like a stroke and stuff like that from the brain bleed, collapsed lung, fractured skull, stuff like that.
Wow.
But yeah, so they put me in a medically induced coma for a better part of 3 days.
Welcome to the Becoming Sound podcast, where we dive into the tough stuff and try to find the humor in the hot mess of being an adult child. Join me as we peel back the layers on growing up in dysfunction, navigating substance abuse, mental health challenges, and everything in between. Hi, and welcome back to the Becoming Sound podcast. Thanks for joining me today. I'm Krista Zaft, your host, and today my guest is Daniel Gospodarek. Daniel has a master's degree in social work from the University of Denver. His professional career has centered around locked settings of jails and inpatient psychiatric hospitals, and he has almost a decade of experience in this realm. His current practice, Revitalized Mental Health, focuses on supporting men who seek healing from past or traumatic experiences. His experience with a traumatic brain injury both defined and challenged his identity and resolve, instilling a deep level of empathy and authenticity to connect with and support the people he works with. So without further ado, let's get started. Hi, welcome, Daniel. How are you?
Hey, Krista, I'm doing really well. Thank you for having me on the show.
Good. I'm glad you're here. So I just want to jump right in. And can you just give a little background on yourself?
Yeah,
And just explain kind of some of the stuff you went through.
for sure. So, one of the reasons that you and I connected was because of my traumatic brain injury
Yeah.
and how that kind of directed me to the social work profession. So, starting with the traumatic brain injuries, that was back in July of 2009. It was an auto accident, and essentially that because of the auto accident, I needed to then have brain surgery to stop the brain bleed. And there was a few other, I guess, issues like a stroke and stuff like that from the brain bleed, collapsed lung, fractured skull, stuff like that.
Wow.
But yeah, so they put me in a medically induced coma for a better part of 3 days, and then kind of weaned me out during the day or weaned me off, and then we put me back in nighttime. So spent 10 days in the ICU, and then 7 days inpatient rehab, and then that led to 3 months of physical therapy with 17 months of speech therapy.
Wow.
So
It's a lot.
yeah, and that was so that the time frame too, that was in between my junior and senior year of high school. So
Okay.
those are pretty pivotal times for forming young adulthood and
Yeah, exactly.
launching
Exactly.
into career or college or finding yourself, right? So
Yeah.
there's a lot of layers there, from grief and loss to identity challenges, the hallmarks of TBI, injuries, kind of the lingering symptoms.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, all those pieces
hmm
were a part of it. So
Yeah. Um, I want to talk a little bit about how that affects people, because I know there is a correlation between traumatic brain injuries and addiction or mental health challenges. Stuff comes up, right? Because you got a
yeah,
lot going on. Do you want to talk
yeah,
about that?
yeah, definitely. So even kind of backing up and just looking at traumatic brain injuries, it's in the word, like the trauma, right?
Yeah.
Typically those are TBIs are sustained in not predictable ways. There are some where, if you play football, for example, like, and have a lot of concussions, or if you're into like skateboarding or something like that,
Yeah.
um, rock climbing, obviously you could hit your head in those kinds of situations. But they're never really predicted, right? Nobody really says they're going to go out and get one. And that trauma itself can lead to trauma symptoms down the road in just by itself. And then also too, depending how that TBI was sustained, uh, could also have elements of PTSD or just meet the criteria all out together. Life-threatening injury, avoidance
Uh-huh.
issues with mood stability. I think where it gets really, really tricky is tried to parse out, like, is the mood challenges because of the TBI or is it because of the mental illness or the trauma, right? Um,
Yeah.
some of the hallmarks of traumatic brain injuries are, difficulties managing impulsivity, challenges with sleep and fatigue levels, anger and rage, right? The changes in the personality from who somebody was to where they are today or who they are today. Um, so those pieces, but then there can also be underlying anxiety, right? That
Mm-hmm.
whether that's around ice because it was a fall, or worry about the future too. Um, there's a lot of different
It's
layers.
really, yeah, really complex, eh?
It is,
Yeah.
and that's why, like, even like being a mental health therapist and working a lot with TBIs, like the mental health component is often only a part of the overall treatment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, there sometimes needs to be speech or occupational therapy or physical therapy. Uh, a lot of different elements are brought together to support somebody in that recovery process.
Yeah, for sure. And I can imagine there's a lot of people that fall through the cracks,
Oh,
that
sure.
don't actually get the help that they need after something like this.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I think we're seeing it right now, like in American football, in sports, like we're seeing
Uh,
even the concussion times being to get back into the sport are being extended, right, to make sure the brain is healed versus just going and getting concussion after concussion after concussion on top of each other, and then really giving that brain time to heal. But yeah, I mean, even concussions can now, are now reaching that traumatic brain injury threshold.
uh,
So,
yeah. A lot
okay.
of hockey players suffer
Mm-hmm.
from that, right?
Definitely,
Getting hit
definitely.
after
And
hit.
there's the hits on the ice, right? Like running into somebody else and like just that sheer jarring. Then there's the hits when they fall and hit the ice, right? If they hit
Uh,
their head, and then there's the physical altercations that sometimes happen in hockey too.
yeah.
So,
And a lot of people are kids when this is happening to them, right? Like they're
mhm.
sustaining this stuff in childhood
Yeah.
because like hitting in Canada here, hitting's in Pee-wee level, right? So that's like
Mhm.
11 and 12-year-olds, I think, or
Yeah.
12, 13. Yeah. It's early.
Yeah, yeah, and the
Yeah.
brain is still, heavily developing during those years too. So then there's a concussion, put it factoring into the development of the overall brain.
Yeah, for sure.
Mhm.
Um, I know that you cover in your practice a lot of men's mental health stuff. And I think those issues are often overlooked, for
Sure.
men especially. It's 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 all too common that men aren't being heard or
Hmm.
they're brushed off as, oh, just suck it up, be a man or whatever the case is, right? When they've got other things going on. So what do you think can be done to address some of these issues?
Mm. So, on a more kind of smaller level, like family level or like friendship level, just that awareness of when somebody might be struggling.
Uh-huh.
And there are the qualities. We don't want to get rid of perseverance. We don't want to get rid of persistence, right? We need those qualities. We need grit in our lives, especially when adversity shows up. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we also need to be able to ask for help, right?
Uh-huh.
Or just saying, hey, maybe talking with somebody would help just work through some of these things, and maybe in a much faster time too, versus kind of white knuckling it for a few years until it just kind of fades away. Um,
Right. Yeah.
so I think the awareness on an individual or like a small group family level, and then I think culturally, at least in the States, I think some of that is shifting to being having more acceptance around seeking therapy,
Uh-huh.
or seeking support, mental health awareness. I think it has a long way to go, right? Because it's happening now, and that is a point in time versus like all the people that are still alive from previous generations or
Yeah.
previous decades, right? So it'll take years to kind of catch up, if you will.
Uh-huh.
So that's another big part is watching those shifts. I think making access to care, like I know COVID was horrific for the world. I do think that one of the silver linings to that was that it pushed a lot of mental health services virtual, and that
Mhm.
opened up a lot of access to care for people who are in rural areas.
Yeah.
Right? They
Yeah,
don't
for
have now.
sure.
Now they might not have to drive 2 hours to see a therapist or
Exactly.
a
Yeah.
psychiatrist. They can just log in.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
there is a big gap for sure. It is, everyone's talking about it more. It's on social media and you're
Yep.
seeing men step up and talk about stuff and really
Uh,
encourage other men to do it too. And the whole realm of speaking about mental health stuff is bigger. But I still think there's a gap there, in actually getting the help that people
yeah.
need.
Yeah.
And and yeah, so it's great. The more people we have working on this, the
Uh,
better, right?
yeah. And just, kind of going back to what I said with those characteristics, like you can be strong and courageous and have the qualities of perseverance and also have mental health challenges, right?
Yeah.
Like it's not a but situation. It's and.
Yeah. It's a yes and.
Hmm. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. That's great. So in your practice, what are some of the ways you differentiate between different types of trauma? How do you start to work that out with people other than the obvious they have a traumatic brain injury, but I'm
Yeah.
sure you deal
Yeah.
with a lot more than that.
Sure. So, I mean, the first step is usually people seeking therapy and asking like, what's going on, right? What's driving you to seek therapy, and sometimes too, people, they're like, hey, I have a lot of anxiety that I need to work on, and then it's not until we really get into it that there's almost like relational trauma just from being a child or having moments of times of neglect from parental figures, or even looking at some of there's the adverse childhood experiences questionnaire from Kaiser,
Uh-huh.
and even looking at that 10-point questionnaire of
Yeah,
you
it's
know
called the
y-
ACE test, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
that, and like, did your parents separate or divorce when you were 0 to 18, right? And that if it's a yes, it's a 1, right? And then the
Uh-huh.
correlations between mental health that may come with that, and or have a parental figure go to prison or jail, have mental health challenges, sexual abuse, physical abuse, or even just having that kind of attunement with your caregivers. It doesn't have to be your parents, because there's plenty of people in the world that are adopted, or
Yeah.
maybe their parents passed away unexpectedly, and now it's grandpa, grandma, or aunt and uncle, and you can still have um, attunement with those caregivers that helps you create a healthy nervous system for yourself. It doesn't just
Yeah.
have to be with your parents. So getting back to answering your question is, sometimes people come for different things, and then we find out as we work, oh, there's other layers that are in here,
Uh-huh.
right? It was really that one time I saw mom do this or dad do this, or when we got the call that my sibling attempted suicide or something like that, right?
Uh-huh.
So those pieces start showing up. But then there's other times where people are like, hey, my significant other cheated on me. We've been together 10 years, 5 years,
Mm-hmm.
whatever it is, so it's pretty clear cut in some cases. um and then in some cases it's like, yeah, like that's the issue, but then there's also betrayals that went back, right, when they were
Uh-huh.
dating, or from previous relationships too,
Yeah.
that can kind of leave their mark on the body when that happens. So
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. It's multifaceted. And
definitely.
people sometimes think, oh, well, I've got this going on. And they
Mm,
don't realize until they start talking about it that it's
yeah.
actually something else. And
Yeah.
it's hard to dig deep and go through the emotions of it and feel what you're feeling and all that stuff. But I think on the other side, a lot of people can't see it when they start, is
Yeah.
just understanding where it comes from
Mm,
frees you
mm,
from.
yes.
It's the start of a layer of healing.
Yeah.
And there's a little bit of freedom that comes from really just understanding where your anxiety is coming from, or where
Mhm.
where that trauma lies and how it's affecting you.
Exactly, and that's part of the approach too that I use, is a lot of bottom up therapy. So somatic experiencing therapy, or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy. And I've just found that talk therapy in general often doesn't have enough effect.
Uh-huh.
Maybe we can change the thoughts, but really it's like that inner self worth, or that inner ability to say no in certain
Yeah.
situations. Um, that really needs to become integrated,
Yeah.
especially from
Those
the
those
trauma.
sit deep.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. and I found people heal more quickly, at least in my anecdotal experience, from the bottom up forms of therapy.
Yeah.
So
And can you explain what bottom up is?
yeah,
So
so
people understand.
yeah, definitely. So bottom up therapy. So talk therapy starts with the brain, works its way down through the brain layers. So the cerebral cortex, the midbrain or the limbic brain, and then the brainstem, and then finally the body and the nervous system. And then bottom up therapies are the inverse of that, right? We start with the body, the nervous system, create safety there, create nervous system flexibility, and then as those experiences are integrated by either EMDR therapy or somatic experiencing therapy, then as those shifts happen, the brain begins to shift, and the thoughts of the person's thoughts of themselves or about the situation begin to shift, right? So,
I think
yeah.
and that's really important too, because years ago when I started therapy, they weren't talking about somatic stuff or EMDR, that type of stuff. So it really was like top down. And I was already at the point where I could rattle off my story like I was talking from a teleprompter, off the 6
Right.
o'clock news, right? And you get really stuck in your head. And so it's great to talk about stuff, but there's a block and sometimes you can't get past that. You really just have
Definitely.
memorized it.
Yeah, and I think that's what happens with trauma, chronic stress, or like, nurses on the front lines during COVID, right? Or, first responders in California, or I know Canada's had some wildfires in the past year or two, right? Like some pretty big ones. And that the mind and the body will disconnect, and it's a huge evolutionary adaptive measure, right?
Yeah.
Because then we can kind of compartmentalize and keep going and do what we need to do. And at the same time, like we need those pieces together to be able to connect with not only ourselves, but also show affection to our children, right? Or connect with a partner, or find joy in the small little moments of peace versus anticipating what's going to happen, right?
Yeah, you don't realize when you shut yourself down that you are actually disconnecting from all of the other things in your life too, not just being able to feel your own feelings, but it really shuts you down from the people and the experiences that are happening.
So why you see people, more, not everyone who does high risk activities like skydiving and stuff like that have trauma, but sometimes people who have trauma will seek out those activities because that is like once they break into that intensity, that's where they can feel emotion, right?
That's so funny you say that. I've been skydiving. So I did this early in my 20s. I call them the reckless years because I really was I didn't realize it at the time what I was doing, but I was whitewater rafting, skydiving. I was just, just behavior that is, I think it was that feeling piece, I wasn't feeling my feelings. And so I was trying to, connect with that. Right. But skydiving will do it. Not that I'm recommending it, but.
Yeah. And again, I'm not implying that everyone who skydives has trauma or
no, not at all.
Seeking emotional connection.
Yeah.
But sometimes people who have trauma will do those things. Or another example I use is like, maybe if you're at a funeral, you'll be able to feel sadness, right? But then if you see something else, like something more minor, right? That maybe in the past used to bring up some emotion, now it doesn't,
right?
Because your body's just operating in like a locked, frozen stance of emotion, and it really takes those intense moments to either pop up, pop down.
Yeah, so true. I can identify. Been there.
Yeah.
Been there. Lots of childhood trauma. So, and it becomes complex. You carry that with you. And when you don't get help for that until later in life, you just, you start to detach from your feelings too. And those traumatic experiences, right?
Definitely. And that can often lead to a lot more trauma.
Anger comes up for sure. I think it's one of the emotions that you're quick to attach to because it's heightened. You feel it at a level that you're just not feeling sadness or, happiness, that type of thing. So, yeah. And anger.
Yeah, I mean, we could continue diving in if
I know, right?
if you have more questions, but we can.
I always say this is like free therapy for me because every time I talk to a therapist, I'm like, oh, all the light bulbs are going off.
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you deal with a lot of first responders and military people like that in your practice?
Yeah, so I do work with them.
Yeah,
It's like exclusively
right.
for them, but typically it's males seeking therapy, whether
Uh-huh.
they're first responders, nurses, doctors, entrepreneurs, just people that are almost in that like chronic on state.
Yeah. High cortisol.
Yeah, exactly. And then, they're kind of, I don't want to say they, but I think people who are in those states are can be very much stuck in like sympathetic nervous system activation.
Uh,
And so it's just like driving. What I use to explain it to a lot of people that I work with is it's like driving a stick shift and having it just stuck in fourth gear, right? So
yeah.
maybe in some places it works great. On the highway, it probably doesn't work great. In the mountains, it doesn't work great. Going downhill, it
Uh-huh.
doesn't work great. But like that's all you got, right? So
Yeah.
sooner or later, you're just gonna burn.
Yeah. Can you explain a little bit about that? I mean, there are different levels of being
Mhm.
stuck in that. There's fight, flight,
Mhm.
there's spawning, there's freezing.
Yeah,
Explain a little bit about what that looks like.
sure. So our nervous system has different states, and this is heavily influenced by polyvagal theory. Polyvagal theory also heavily influences body up forms of therapy. So like
Mhm.
sensory motor, IFS, um, somatic experiencing, EMDR. I think I'm forgetting one in there. Um, but essentially, when we experience that chronic stress, trauma, or chronic traumatization, our nervous system will adapt so that we can essentially meet and perceive threats that are inside of our environment, right? And as we get stuck in that, we don't have that flexibility to either idle up more or idle down when we're sitting by like a bonfire relaxing or something like
Uh-huh.
that, or sitting by the beach. And our primary nervous system states are so we have dorsal vagal, low tone dorsal vagal, ventral vagal, which is like our safe and connected area where we can hang out with friends and just feel calm, cool, collected. Then we have sympathetic, which is that fight or flight, and then we move up one more tier to parasympathetic, and that's high tone dorsal, or like the freeze response. But essentially, like kind of being stuck, like what I was saying in terms of a certain gear and a stick shift. Like that could be like constant worry, constant stress, constant anxiety, constant anger, right? Of whatever
Uh-huh.
whatever has happened and whatever is perceived to happen. And that's kind of going back to that shifting metaphor, is when we experience the stress and trauma, our body and our nervous system can't regulate itself. We're just kind of frozen in one of those states, right?
Yeah.
It, but then there is that appeasement that can happen a lot with childhood trauma, where instead of fighting or freezing, it's actually easier just to go along with in terms of protection.
Yeah.
Right. But all these different states are pretty much like cut out of evolutionary
Uh-huh.
development, right?
Yeah.
If and then everything that happens when we're in those states, the digestive changes, the immune system changes, all those different pieces that happen to respond to threat, right?
Hmm. I think there's a lot of people too that don't realize they're actually in those states
Sure.
because they've been coping at that level for so long. It's
Yeah.
like that's normal to them, and they
Mhm.
don't really realize that they're not operating
Right.
um, in a state where they can fire on all cylinders. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Right. Exactly.
yeah,
Exactly. It can become the new norm.
yeah,
And that's something we also have to work through in therapy, is because there's a new norm, your body, because it's just so evolved, will also perceive regulating to ventral as a threat, or it can.
yeah,
Because
like
what happens
regulating back to calm is a
yeah,
threat. Yeah,
right. Because what happens if something happens when I'm calm,
yeah,
right?
yeah. For people who have been hypervigilant a lot their
Mhm.
lives, expecting even when there's no threat, they're just you're expecting it. You're still living in that heightened state, and to
Mhm.
come down into a calm state, exactly that. There's another
Right.
threat because you're not on guard,
Right.
right? Yeah, which is kind of a scary state to live in, but it becomes people's normals, right?
For sure.
Um, I just wanted to ask you about what some of the effective techniques would be for managing some of these high pressure environments, like people who are on the front lines or people who've had traumatic brain injuries that are in that heightened response, people with trauma.
Mhm. So general coping skills are probably will buy you time if you're in the situation or it just happened. But really trying to force yourself to find those activities and or moments where maybe there's pure silence or it's just you, right? You could be working out, you could be going for a walk, right? You could be just having 5 minutes in your room, just hanging out. Uh, but really trying to slow that body down so that
Mhm.
we can notice, track, and name what's happening inside of our body. Because oftentimes what happens is we have this event, our body spikes to respond, and maybe there's a little dip because we're going back to regulation, and then something else will happen. Or
Mhm.
a bill comes in the mail and it's like, okay, you got to turn back on, right? Whatever that is. So it's really finding those things that work. I think temperature changes are a really cool thing to play with, and I'm not giving any like specifics because everyone's going to be different. Like I respond very well to like warm or hot water,
Okay.
right? Some people might be cold water, right? Um, some people may really enjoy like putting some weights on a bar and squatting, right? Or working out with that. Some people may also just find a lot of regulation and just stretching, right?
Uh-huh.
So temperature, physical activity, um, I think maintaining a healthy diet also underpins a lot of this stuff, right?
Uh-huh.
So I think it's been a while since I looked at it, but I want to say like 80% of people who experience a PTSD life-altering event won't develop PTSD if it's their first time, and that's for adults. And that's usually because of A, their support system, and B, their internal buffers are already built up enough, right? Now that's a lot
Right.
different for children who don't have those internal
Yeah.
buffers, and sometimes their support system is the one doing the traumatizing. So
Mhm.
that's a different equation. But so if we can maintain those pieces, support network, and just our overall health and internal kind of peace and wellness, then we can buffer against some of those
Yeah,
pieces.
that's a big one because
Mhm.
there's a lot of correlation between diet
Mm,
and moving your body
right.
and your mental health for sure.
That also getting enough rest as well. I know sometimes people with trauma struggle with sleeping because you're more vulnerable when you're asleep. But finding a safe place to do that or where you could feel safe.
Uh-huh.
But then on the other end too, with traumatic brain injuries, if you keep fatigue is a symptom, and sometimes it takes time to work through that, but you also need to maybe start like challenging yourself a little bit of not sleeping 16 hours a day, right?
Yeah.
Even though you feel like you could, like maybe obviously do that and listen to your body and talk to your medical professionals as you start to shift this, but maybe your body needs that in the beginning for the first few months or whatever it is,
Uh-huh.
6 months. And then it's like, okay, can I start trimming off an hour or two, right?
Yeah, it's like someone in a depressive state could also be sleeping a lot too. Not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily. There's lots of different ways depression shows up, but just wanting to hide out and that becomes chronic sleeping kind of
Yeah.
thing. That can be just as damaging. I want to talk a little bit about what kind of changes that you think would be helpful specifically for men in mental health.
It's related to the building that awareness on the family level and the community level that both men and women need support, right? But for men, like noticing and being with some of those stigmas that are maybe barriers for men seeking treatment, right? Not being seen as weak, um, maybe not even like, oh, I don't have the time for that. Like that's not my priority, right? But then that mental health component also impacts your relationship with those you care about, your work performance, your own self-esteem, and starting to have those conversations both at the family community level and then larger
Mm-hmm.
political levels of state and federal. But and then also making again access to care is something that's going to open
Yeah.
up a lot of stuff for folks.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
I know there's some therapists here. I had spoke to a lady who they offer, so many free sessions, right, for people who can't afford
Mm-hmm.
or someone who doesn't have access to, support, that type of thing. So I think that would really help too, is
Yeah.
knowing that there's places out there that, if you are financially not able, which
Yeah.
is a big thing for people, right?
Yeah, definitely. And like for me, I'm only a private pay therapist, and it's a little different, I know, in Canada with insurance and stuff and how insurance is privatized in the US, but uh
Okay.
so I don't take insurance.
Right.
So usually I hold like one or two spots,
Yeah.
or for people who can't pay the full fee or can't pay at all.
Right, exactly, which is nice. And it's good to know that there's a lot of therapists that do
Mhm.
that, even in private. So same thing here. We have both private
Mhm.
and insurance. What's one of the ways that you practice self-care and keeping your own mental health
Yeah,
and in check, especially after a traumatic brain
yeah,
injury?
definitely, right? So I guess there's not just one. I know you asked for one, but um,
Well, a few.
so yeah, so it's staying physically active, eating healthy again, trying to get 6-8 hours of sleep a night. Um, let's see, finding those little pieces that you like to do. So I really enjoy reading. I just kind of even after like a day of therapy or a day of work, like I'll still read before bed.
Uh-huh.
It just helps me kind of calm down from the hecticness of life. And then when I go to sleep, I don't need to like my mind's not spinning, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Because there's those times where you watch a movie and then you go to bed and your mind's just like flying through the movie scenes and stuff, and you're like, wow, like this is kind of cool, but it's like I'm tired, so
yeah.
I need to shut this off. And for me, I found that being able to read before bed, and again, there's also like the nighttime routine, right? Whether you take a shower, brush your teeth, like you send all those cues send signs to your body or signals to your body that we're starting to idle down,
Uh-huh.
right?
Yeah,
So really kind of building in that phased gradual change.
yeah. I think a big one too, and not a lot of men talk about it either, but journaling at night,
Mhm.
it's almost like getting that stuff out of your head, putting it down on
Yeah.
paper, your worries or whatever it is that
Yeah.
is happening at that time. And for some reason, it disconnects it from your brain a little
Mhm.
bit and allows you to actually go to sleep, right? It's like you've
Yeah.
put them somewhere and then you can just
Mhm.
put them aside you can pick it up in the morning if you want, but
Right. Right.
right?
And yeah, it's interesting with writing that psychomotor connection is so fascinating of how it can release
Yeah,
and then it's just on paper.
yeah.
So journaling, right? You could journal at night or in the morning, or any point in the day. Also, too, in line with journaling, but different is like the gratitude journals, right?
Uh-huh.
So if somebody notices like heavily negative in my life, right, and like I'm struggling to see the positives, right?
Yeah.
Starting to flip that script to notice the positives, notice the things that you're grateful for.
Yeah,
Can be
it's hard to see
huge
that when you're so stuck in your
Oh, yes.
stuff. It takes actual physical practice. And that's why
Oh, yeah.
sometimes people are like typing on their phone and stuff, but there's something about a pen to paper that is
Mm-hmm.
very, very different
Mm-hmm.
that engages you somehow. So I think
Yeah.
yeah,
It is very interesting.
yeah. Do you have any memorable stories that you could share? Obviously, no names, but from your practice, really, that highlights the power of healing and how people can come back from an injury or a trauma?
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a few that stand out, but so for example, EMDR therapy, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy can bring about pretty rapid changes, and sometimes depending on a rapid healing, and sometimes that healing is delayed. So what I mean by that is in EMDR therapy, we usually pick a memory to focus on, and then engage in some sort of eye movements or tapping to integrate that, integrate and heal that kind of dysfunctional memory and experience that you had, not into a positive one, because we can't change if it was a crappy experience,
Right.
but we can change how the experience impacts you. And there are sometimes I work with people, and I've noticed with younger folks, there's this and the research kind of shows this too with EMDR therapy, that the younger you are, the faster EMDR therapy tends to work, because there's a lot less neural connections or associations related to that memory. So I've had some people reprocess a memory in one session, and that is awesome.
Wow.
And then there's also, again, going back to like grit and perseverance, right? We need those qualities. And for the men listening, like, it's not that we want to get rid of those qualities. It's just that we need to know when they aren't serving us as they should be, right? And then so another person, we worked on the same memory weekly for 3 months,
Wow.
but then we got there, right?
Yeah.
So like some of those things are just incredible to witness. And then some of them are like, yep, just slow and steady, like commitment, and we'll get through this.
Yeah, exactly. Everyone moves at their own pace, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember going to it was like a professional development course, and we were doing a lot of like just unpacking some of the childhood stuff. We weren't talking about specific experiences, but just in different little exercises we were going through some like addressing your daddy issues or your mom and whatever you're holding on to. And she was telling us that she has kids do this too, same exercise. And she said they get through it like in a fraction of the time that the adults get through it, right? And the reason is because they don't have as much in their suitcase because they're just not as old, right?
Right.
And their brain just fires differently too. And so they're able to process things so much faster, you know?
Yeah.
And so we're doing an exercise for 3 days and the kids have they're done in 1 day, you know, they're all done.
Yeah. It's really interesting to watch how children or even young adults respond to, trauma therapy versus adults that are, 40, 50, 60 years old.
Which is encouraging too. It's more apparent now for sure. Younger people are talking about it, especially they're the social media age. And so, years ago we didn't have that. And so people weren't talking about it. If there are young people listening, I encourage them so much to start that therapy and start that process when they're younger, and what a difference it makes in your life, going forward, having kids, moving on to different places in your life and different stages. It really helps to try to unpack that when you're younger. So what else have you got going on that you want to share?
I mean, definitely doing these podcasts, something I value, getting my message story out, but also just like that it is possible for people to heal from mental health challenges, especially trauma, infidelity, betrayal trauma, stuff like that. And then also continuing blogging. So that's something I enjoy doing, is just writing, a few blog articles a month just to stay relevant on what I'm doing, but also, if there's any changes in research or any kind of like interesting topics that just come to my mind.
Yeah.
And then currently wrapping up somatic experiencing therapy training. So that will be later in August and then February of next year. So really, focusing in on wrapping up somatic experiencing training. And that should be August and February of next year. And then, just, I don't know where I'll go, if I go more like into the consultation with EMDR or, continue to dive into somatic experiencing. But that's...
And you do online as well?
Yeah. So I offer online services. So how it works in the States is like, I'm licensed in Wisconsin as well as in Colorado. So I can see people who reside in those states.
Okay.
I can't like see somebody from New York or Canada or Australia.
Right.
But yeah, so online. And then I also have an office in Kenosha, Wisconsin. So usually do in person on the weekends if people want that.
But if you are from those states, great. And if you're not, you can still keep up with, what's going on and find out stuff on your blog, which is great.
Yeah,
sometimes people are just looking for information and to, get some stuff that way. My last question I wanted to ask was, if you could give one piece of advice to someone who's struggling that has had a traumatic brain injury specifically, what would that be?
Yeah, so that's going to be my hardest thing that I struggled with, was after the maybe not not right away after the TBI because it takes a while for things to settle in.
Uh-huh.
But maybe like a month or two later, as things start to kind of come together and like the shock is off, and you're like, "Holy, this is gonna be a long process." Is not you're gonna want to rush that process,
Uh-huh.
but it's very important that you don't because your body needs that time to heal.
Yeah.
Yeah, like there are so many times where I'm like, I wish I could just fast forward, 9 months, and yeah, I mean, I don't have that ability to. So that just that thought alone is going to create more stress in my life versus just being in the moment
Yeah. Oh,
and
that's so
just working
important.
on, like one thing at a time, one speech therapy session at a time, one, reading a book at a time, or getting a good night's sleep, and like just building those layers of foundation, right? And then
Mm-hmm.
pretty soon, like as those layers will start building, and then it's just you can start leaping once you're a year, 2 years, 3 years, and I know everyone's TBI is different, so sometimes those leaps will look a lot different to every person.
Yeah. And I think it's so important to be in the moment with with where you are, right? And
Yeah.
not exactly try to rush that.
Yeah, and
Yep.
there's a lot of acceptance that goes. Acceptance it sounds like such an easy word,
Uh,
but I think a lot of people and I say that because I struggled with it for a long time afterwards.
yeah.
It's not that easy to really come to grips with.
Yeah.
Just
Well,
like
especially as a
changing it.
teenager.
Yeah,
I mean, that's a tough time for
right,
the
right. But
best of times. It's tough.
right. But then also too, if it was, a husband or a wife or a partner that has one, and there goes, if they can't work for a year
Okay.
or ever again, like there goes their income potential for a
Yeah.
family unit. Like there, every moment has its own stressors.
So important. Well, thank you so much. I have enjoyed talking to you, and I do know a couple people with traumatic brain injuries, and that's yeah, it's a tough space sometimes to be in,
Mhm.
and to get that help that you need, and reach out to people and not be afraid
Yeah,
to speak up for yourself.
yeah. It
Yeah.
just it is. But I've greatly enjoyed this too, Krista.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining me today on another episode of Becoming Sound. If this episode resonated with you in some way, please share it with someone you care about. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button. It helps to get this information out to more people who may need it. If you have a sec, I would love a follow on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. While you're there, hit the 5-star rating and give me a review. When you're scrolling, follow me on my social platforms, and I would love to hear your comments and feedback. Have a fabulous day, lots of love and gratitude from me. Please note, the views, information, and opinions expressed during the Becoming Sound podcast series are solely those of the individuals involved. The content of this podcast is to educate, inform, and for entertainment purposes only. This podcast series and the content presented does not constitute for medical or other professional advice or services. If you are in crisis or in need of help, please contact your medical or professional provider.